All right. The next lecture here is Basic Botany. And so there's a PowerPoint, and here's the Basic Botany in Canvas. And underneath this PowerPoint, I will include this lecture. So some of this might be review if you've had other science classes before, and if so, great. And if not, there's a lot of important vocabulary in this lecture. So first of all, flowers. There are perfect and imperfect flowers, and there's nothing wrong with an imperfect flower. It is just incomplete from a reproductive standpoint. A perfect flower has both the male and female parts in the same flower. That's all it means. It is perfect in that it has the ability to have all of the parts to reproduce, but it doesn't necessarily have the ability to reproduce on its own. Some flowers that are perfect might be incompatible with the male and female portions in that plant. They have to cross out with some other plant. Very important concept. But perfect flowers, whether they're self-compatible or not, have both male and female parts. The imperfect flowers have only one functional sex in each flower. So there might be something that looks like the male part of the flower, but on closer inspection, you'll realize that it's dysfunctional. It doesn't have any viable living pollen in it. It's just some residual parts that are developed there that don't do anything. And the same with the male flowers that have potentially, in some cases, what appears to be the female flower parts in there, but on closer look, they're really not all there. It's just a structure, kind of a fill in the blank or a placeholder structure that is a dysfunctional, incomplete female portion. So we call the female portion, or the female type flowers with functional female parts, carpellate or pistillate flowers. Now, carpellate is the modern word. I would prefer you use the term carpellate because it means it has carpels, which is the segments of female flower parts. Pistillate is an old-fashioned word, but it is, again, so interlaced with the vocabulary of flowers and biology that I think it's right up there with legumes. Legumes is a word that ain't going to go away, and neither is pistil or pistillate. And so a lot of people use the term. And so I put them both because I think you should be aware of them both. Carpellate, scientifically modern, scientifically accurate. Pistillate, historically important, and you need to be aware that exists. And the male flowers are called staminate flowers because they contain the stamen of the flower. So here's a couple of cartoon illustrations of a perfect flower containing the both male and female parts, and the pistillate flower containing just, or carpellate flower containing just the female parts. And I believe on the next slide, yes, on the next slide, I give you a nice illustration that translate well into a printed text for the lab when we do the class face-to-face. I certainly could use a nicer, more colorful picture on the Canvas version of this test on a midterm or final, but you know, it might be an online test, it might be a printed test. So just to keep it simple, I always use this illustration, and so memorize it. The key is up here. I'm not going to go through this. You should know what all these terms mean. If not, Google it, look it up, read about it, understand what these parts are and what they do. More flower terminology. There is monaceous. Mono means one. Monaceous is a male and female flowers are on the same plant. One plant, male and female flowers. Dioecious, male and female flowers are on the separate plants. So you literally have a plant with male flowers only or a plant with female flowers only, and you talk about them as male and female plants. And so that's considered dioecious. And some plants that are monoecious include things like corn and squash and lettuce and sunflowers, and I could go on for hundreds of different things. My brain would lock up before I listed all of the monoecious plants. There's lots of them. It is more common. Now, in a lot of biology, they don't talk about the perfect flowers as being monoecious. It is only when you have separate flowers. And I don't really care which way one goes and one and the other idea where perfect flowers aren't included in monoecious. In a casual way, I sometimes do. In a strict scientist way, it is only when you have separate flowers on the same plant. Corn has totally separate flowers, and they're different. If you've ever looked at corn, they have the silks and the tassels. And let me just go there. Corn, silk, tassel. And so here's the corn silks. On the end of the corn, you have these silks which come out of the corn cob. So this is the young developing corn, and here are the silks coming out of it. That's the female flowers. At the very top of the plant are the tassels, and the tassels are the male part. So up high in the wind, shaking around, are the tassels that are the male flowers, and they spread pollen into the wind that goes everywhere. And down below where the corn cobs are developing, every single kernel of corn on every cob has its own silk that's hanging out there going, pollinate me, pollinate me. Squash has very distinct staminate and pistillate flowers. And so here you can see a male flower, and it has the pollen structures in the center of the male flower. Blow that up a little bit. The female does not have the pollen producing structures. It has just a small stigma where the pollen would land to start maturing the fruit. And if you look closely, oh shoot, yeah, here's an example. It's not a very good picture. But here's a female flower developing the fruit, and male flowers. Here's a cluster of male flowers. You can see none of these have anything that even looks like it would be swelling at all. It's just on a stalk. These would be all male flowers. So again, a very different appearance to the male and female flowers. Oh, here's a good picture of them together. Male flowers, female flower from the outside. All right. So for monoecious, from a scientific standpoint, I'm going to stick to the ones that have separate male and female flowers. Don't worry if somebody includes all of the perfect flower plants like the lettuce and broccoli and other things in there. Worry about that only if you get into hardcore science. Dioecious, separate plants. Asparagus is a great example. Spinach. And I say sort of because it depends. Some spinach varieties have both male and female on the same plant. Some are separate, male plants and female plants. But if you have a female plant and you leave it unpollinated for long enough, it will start to turn male and produce male flowers. It's like, wait a minute, we're not getting any pollen. And if those females go too long without any pollen, they will make their own male flowers and sprinkle some pollen on themselves. Um, Spinach is an odd duck in that way. So nature doesn't fit into the nice little boxes we like to make. Nature does its own thing. But even though nature doesn't always fit into the boxes, it's still convenient to have the boxes to talk about. Boxes like monoecious and dioecious. So next we're going to talk about pollination. And there are different mechanisms of pollination, but pollination is the transfer of pollen from a male flower to a female flower, or from the male portion of the flower to the female portion of the flower. Now, sometimes it can be on the same plant, sometimes it has to go to another plant, or sometimes it can do whatever it wants, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the male portion produces pollen, and so you can see here are the pollen producing anthers, the anthers on top of a filament. All together, we call that a stamen. The stamen is the entire male structure. A single male structure is a stamen made up of a filament. There's another filament with an anther on top. Inside of the anther is the pollen. And the pollen produces inside of it sperm cells. And it's the sperm cells that are actually being delivered to the egg cell inside of the female ovule in the flower. So the bee here is spreading some of this pollen around while it's gathering nectar. But some plants are wind pollinated, like spinach, beets, and corn. Pollen is made in large quantities and it spreads around by the wind and lands indiscriminately on everything, from every other type of flower that's not spinach, beets, or corn. If you have allergies, you know about acacias and ragweed. They also produce huge amounts of pollen. Pine trees, huge amounts of pollen. Oak trees, huge amounts of pollen. It's all about just spreading it out on the wind. And it goes indiscriminately everywhere. Insects, that's what we usually think about. The average person, I would say, they think of pollination. They usually picture a bee running around doing its thing. And bees and other insects, and even some other organisms, bats, even mammals are responsible for pollination in some cases. And squash and broccoli are two great examples of things we grow in this area in large amounts that are insect pollinated. And then some are self-pollinated. In the same flower is usually what we're talking about, but it could be on a different flower on the same plant. But usually most self-pollinating plants, as the flower is maturing and opening, it pollinates itself right there inside the same flower. And that includes things like lettuce and tomato and many others. And so they're called self-compatible because their pollen from the same plant can pollinate a flower on the same plant and produce seed. Others maybe can't do that. So there's different mechanisms. One is called outcrossing. Outcrossing is where pollen from one plant goes to another plant that is genetically dissimilar. They're not genetically identical. So if I have a whole bunch of clones, an example would be a tomato patch in the Galapagos Islands. All of the tomatoes in a tomato patch in the wild, they're all clones of each other. They're all genetically identical. Even though they're individual separate plants, they're effectively all genetically identical to each other. So the pollen can go anywhere to any flower and be compatible. We still call that selfing. But outcrossing, you're taking pollen from one genetic plant to a genetically different plant of the same species. Humans, we're all genetically different. Everybody's unique unless you're an identical twin. But in plants, you can have lots of identical organisms, individuals. And you can have lots that are genetically different. Things like oak trees, they're more like humans. Every oak tree is different than the next. So self-compatible outcrossing is when they could self, the plant is biologically capable of selfing, but it doesn't have to. It also can outcross. And most self-compatible plants are also capable of outcrossing. It's just a matter of what percentage. And things like tomato or lettuce, it's really rare. The way the pollen is structured, it doesn't spread. Bees aren't attracted to move the pollen, and it's not likely you're going to get much outcrossing. Other plants that are self-compatible, you get a lot of outcrossing and a lot of selfing. It just depends. Then there are plants that are self-incompatible. So if you have a self-incompatible broccoli variety, for example, some broccoli is self-incompatible and some is not. And so if you have a self-incompatible broccoli, even though the pollen is perfectly viable, if it falls on its own plant or one that's too genetically similar, that pollen can't fertilize the egg. It won't. And it usually goes down to a very simple genetic control, and you can only cross between different genetic keys of these self-incompatible plants. So you need a different key of the pollen in order to unlock or fertilize the egg. As long as they're different, it works. If they're the same, it's blocked. And there's advantages genetically in the wild. It promotes diversity. It promotes the exchange of genetic material in the maximum way to promote diversity, and that's good. But it also can be bad if there's not a whole lot of you in the wild. If all you've got is some other individuals with the same genetic information, the same genetic signal for this self-incompatibility, you can't cross. And so if you have small populations, you can go extinct in that population if you are dependent on self-incompatibility mechanisms of breeding. So pluses and minuses for the two different methods. So we've already talked about selfing, what that is, as I talked about self-compatible, but outcrossing of self plants are ones that can self but didn't. The pollen went somewhere else. Selfing is when they do, like tomato, like lettuce, they do pollinate and fertilize themselves on the same plant, possibly the same flower, and produce seed. When they do that for a number of generations, they become like clones. And so after 8, 9, 10 generations, they become highly uniform, stable genetic clones. And so you get these little populations that are all little clones of themselves. And it's great for breeding because what do I want to sell to the farmer? A bunch of clones that are all going to look and grow exactly the same. And so breeding lettuce, for example, that's an advantage on one hand. Without going into the breeding, it's also a disadvantage, but I won't get into that. So when we're talking about breeding, when we're talking about pollination and the mechanism of pollination, we can have what are called open pollinated crops. I was just talking about lettuce. What can I do with lettuce? I can just grow my lettuce seed out in the seed field and let it do its thing. Let it pollinate itself. I don't have to do anything. I do have to keep other plants away from it, but I had a habit of keeping things anywhere from 2 to 10 feet apart, depending on how isolated I needed them to be. And that's it. As long as they're 10 feet apart, I don't have to worry about accidental cross pollination. It's just open pollinated and it selfs all by itself. And it produces these highly inbred genetic clones. And the variety of lettuce that we grow are just the inbreds. We just let it inbreed till it gets to a genetically uniform clone stage. We do this hundreds of times to different plants, pick the ones that are really good and say, here's a good clone. I'm going to sell that to the farmer. And then to make more of it, I just grow more and let it open pollinate. It's easy to maintain, but what's one of the disadvantages? One of a couple of disadvantages? It's easy to steal. If I see a gorgeous head of lettuce in the grocery store, you know how I can steal it? Take it into my lab and grow it, and I've got the seed. Boom, done. You're like, but there's no seed in there. Doesn't matter. I can take just a tiny piece of tissue out of the core of the lettuce, grow that into a plant, take that plant, and make seed out of it. And I stole it that fast. Not so good. And I'm going to take a quick break here.